Welcome everyone to a new episode of Maktisi Street. My name is Usama and I'm here with my brothers Karim and Seti as usual. And today we are delighted to welcome a very special guest, Michael Barenboim, who is a world famous violinist, a professor at the Barenboim-Said Akademie, and a concertmaster of the West-Eastern Divan Orchestra, which was founded by his father, Daniel Barenboim, and our uncle, Edward Said. Since early 2024, Michael has come into the spotlight for speaking out about Gaza, about the situation of Palestinians. He is part of Make Freedom Ring, which is a classical musicians collective supporting Palestine, and a member of the Palestinian Jewish Academics, PGA, which is based in Berlin. He is also a co-curator of the Kileme Talks, platforming Palestinian artists and academics, and leads this ensemble called the Ensemble Nesmi, which is a classical ensemble of Palestinian musicians. Michael, welcome to Maktisi Street.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Well, Michael, I guess our first and inevitable question would be, how did someone such as yourself, a brilliant violinist, how did you go from being a violinist, or why did you go from being a violinist to becoming a voice of conscience, in a sense, speaking out about the Gaza genocide so forcefully and for Palestinian equality and rights? What made you go from one to the other?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know the answer. The only thing I can say is that, so if you live in Germany, you'll recall on the 9th of October, former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant uttered the now infamous, no water, no electricity, no fuel, no food. These are human animals, and we must act accordingly. We all know this by memory. And around the same time, on that day or the day after, German politicians stood at the Brandenburg Gate, which was lit up in the colors of the Israeli flag, and said there is only one place for Germany, and that is by the side of Israel. So for me, to hear on one hand the promise of genocide, and on the other hand the promise to support it, was very revealing. Of course, the story didn't start then, but that was a very stark moment in German politics, and it felt to me like this was, of course, obviously unacceptable, but also it felt very important to do whatever one can to change this. Of course, it's not that I'm going to change German policy by whatever I do, but if nobody tries, then of course nothing happens. And since then, I've been trying as much as I can in all these different formats that I work in, and in all kinds of ways to counter this narrative, and to put the question of Palestine at the center of the thinking of people. Because in Germany, mentioning Palestine, Palestinians, it's difficult. It's always problematic. That's why they always use, inhabitants of Gaza and things like this. They rarely like to speak of Palestinians. So I thought it's important for people like me that with the history that I have, and also the knowledge that I have. I mean, I learned a lot from speaking to Palestinians, from reading. It just felt like it was the right moment to share this, just very simply.
Well, Michael, but I mean, that's really revealing. But in a sense, you're not just an ordinary violinist you're also Michael Barenboim. So, did you feel a special responsibility, or I mean, and what was the case before October 2023? Did you, for example, I mean, presumably you had met, obviously you've been working with Palestinians for a time. So, is it that something happened in that day, and just the Brandenburg Gate, that whole sort of the dehistoricization or the invisibilization of Palestinians, is that what prompted you in that moment? Or was there something prior? And did you realize, and do you know, the fact that you are who you are would make it more controversial or more symbolic or more important?
Yeah, I think I was too slow to understand the role I could be playing in this discourse, especially in Germany. It took me much too long, and I deeply regret it. I mean, in my position with with the person that I am, I should have been much more active, much more outspoken long before October 2023. I think that me and people like me, you can't turn the clock back, right? But there has to be an understanding that we have really failed, Palestinians, but also just humanity in general, by not, using our voice and our tools at the maximum capacity. Gaza was under horrible blockade for decades. There was no real explanation not to do this. So I really regret that, and I can't turn the clock back. The only thing I can do is to try to do as much as I can now that it's full blown genocide, and that it's almost already. I mean, I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but it's, I mean, footage from Gaza now, it just looks like the end of times. I don't know what to say anymore. But yeah, I mean, that's really it.
But Michael, in terms of visibility, I mean, your prominence as a musician, I guess the question is, in a way, do you feel your prominence as a musician gives you a special responsibility? I mean, in other words, did you feel a burden? I mean, of course, the main point you're making is that in the context of genocide, and of course before the genocide, or in another form of the genocide, really, the occupation and Nakba, ethnic cleansing and so forth, which goes back 75 years, everybody has a responsibility to speak out. And of course, most people aren't speaking out. So I guess let me just re-ask Osama's question. What was the burden that came to you? Why you? Is it just do you think it's an obligation as all human beings should be speaking out about this nightmare, or is it something that you felt because of your prominence as a musician, your prominence socially? Like, what was it that kind of triggered your sense of your need to intervene, in this into this context? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think everyone has this obligation. I mean, genocide obliges everyone to do what they can to prevent it. I mean, in small ways, in big ways, whatever means one should use them. And that's why I say this, that I really regret not having been as active as this before. Of course, there's certain things about me that make it that make my person doing this quite important in Germany, in the context of Germany. The fact that I'm Jewish, of course, but also the fact that I'm a German citizen, that I grew up in Berlin. I've been in Berlin since I'm 7 years old. So that all these factors, also the institution I work in, the Barenboim-Said Akademie, that that is based on the ideas of the West-Eastern Divan Orchestra, as developed by my father and Edward Said. So also the responsibility towards, in a way, also towards Edward Said's legacy. I think that's of course that's hard to push through in the German discourse, because you'll be surprised at how little people know Edward Said's work. It's quite shocking. But I mean, all of these factors, I think, play a role, and also being famous, relatively speaking, of course, being somewhat prominent. I think that gives you certain obligations. You have a certain platform, you have a certain reach, and one should do with these things the best one can. And the best thing I can think of at the moment is to be involved in all the organizations that Usama has mentioned at the beginning. Also to look at German media coverage and try to scandalize as much of it as possible, because it's without words. You had a few weeks ago Asal Rad here, who spoke about the kind of international media and her her great work with the correction of headlines and everything. I mean, I think if she took 5 minutes to look at what's going on in German media, she'd have a much more positive view on the on the international media. So there's a lot of that as well. Also sharing and spreading Palestinians work from Gaza, journalists work from Gaza, at least the ones that are left. Also, other voices from beyond. Also, like just platforming Palestinians as much as possible, so that there's always this sense in Germany that to speak about Palestinians is somewhat off-putting, because for Germans, you have to understand, for Germany, the way they made up for the Holocaust is by paying reparations and supporting what they think of as the collective Jew, Israel, right? So to say that that Israel is committing atrocity crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, I mean, there's not a crime that they haven't committed. To say this and to remind people in Germany of the existence of Palestinians as the people that that suffered the Nakba of 1948, that also has a certain sense of German responsibility. To remind people in Germany of these things is very uncomfortable, but it's very important because they don't want to talk about it. Now I think now it's just so glaring. The footage we get from Gaza, what's happening in Gaza, the famine and the relentless bombing, the double taps and all these horrible things, the mass graves. I mean, it goes on and on. Now it's kind of impossible to run away from it, but it's still spoken of in a very decontextualized way. Obviously, nobody talks about October 6th and before. And it's all made to seem like, October 7th is a kind of day one, and everything that happens after it is a reaction to it. And in most cases, people see it as a legitimate reaction that has gone too far, or that has been taken too far. So the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, who's now started voicing some mild criticism in terms of the rhetoric, for example, speaking about the attack on the journalist at Nasser Hospital, that this is unacceptable in an otherwise legitimate campaign against Hamas. So there's this sense like what is going on is unacceptable, but we shouldn't forget that this all started when this and therefore the support for Israel is still there 100%, even though the decision to revoke new export licenses doesn't mean that they're not delivering arms. They're still delivering arms. It's just they're not, at least reportedly, they're not issuing new export licenses for arms that could be used in Gaza. So also that little restriction there. It's if you think about what's happening in the West Bank, that doesn't seem to disturb many people in Germany. And I rarely find the right words to it's quite shocking. So yes, to give a short answer, there's a lot about what's going on in Germany that makes it important that people like me use their platform. But there's also some things about my person that make it also easier for me to do this without facing the kind of insane repression that other people are facing in Germany in terms of losing jobs, losing opportunities, being chastised, etc., being arrested. All these things happen to other people, and I'm lucky because I have these parameters that make me who I am. I can do this, and therefore it's even more of a responsibility to use every day to actually do that.
Michael, I want to come back to you talking about what's going on in Germany. And specifically, you talked about, of course, the importance of the kind of guilt and, as you mentioned, the kind of obligation, what they feel officially anyways, an obligation to, I think you mentioned sort of the collective Jew or the collective, so Israel, basically. And, on the one hand, that's understandable. And there was a Holocaust, they committed genocide. So, of course, there's this feeling of responsibility. On the other hand, they also committed a genocide in Namibia well before that. And there's a long history of racism and colonialism that I think sometimes is too easily dismissed in the sense of saying, well, this is simply guilt or sense of obligation. So, you need to understand our history and we need to figure this out. And I don't think so. I think there's something much deeper than that. There's a deep sense of racism in at least official German. I don't know if the society itself has changed. I'm sure there's a lot of some kind of opposition. Of course, there are voices such as yourself, but there are other voices. Just yesterday, I think there was some protests and yet another crackdown in Berlin. We're seeing the pictures. It's really quite brutal and quite violent. So do you have a sense of, in this kind of German society, is this sense of violence and racism beyond towards Arabs, towards Palestinians, towards all this kind of stuff? Its relationship with guilt towards Jews who they had done the same to, who they considered also as obviously subhuman, etc. in a previous time. So is there something repressed within this kind of German psyche that needs to be really discussed and brought to the open?
I mean, obviously, the question of racism is central, of course, to this. I mean, the way Germans speak about Palestinian journalists, the way Germans speak about Palestinian doctors, it's of course there's no other way to say it. Obviously, there's a deep sense of racism in official Germany, but also in a lot of German society. And that's a core issue, of course. When you look at Palestine, it becomes a bit more repressed and more fascistic than with other issues. But of course, you raising the genocide on what is now Namibia is a good point, because that's where of course the German official response is that this is a genocide on today's terms. So in today's terms, right? I mean, that's crazy. If you think about it, what would you say about the Holocaust then? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to speak this way. But of course, with the Holocaust, there's a totally different way of remembering than with the genocide in today's Namibia, and I think it's very revealing. Of course. Again, I think that Palestinians, we have in Berlin the largest Palestinian community in Europe. I think something that people don't know. People don't know this because it's completely silenced. There's no cultural center. There's nothing. They just live there, and they have to be silent. They have to be quiet. They cannot speak out, because they're always when they're allowed to speak, they're only allowed to speak in this very, very German frame. Do you support the Israel's right to exist? Do you condemn Hamas? Do you do this? Do you do that? All this stuff? So it's I think there's a real problem of racism also towards other Arabs and just others. I think it's undeniable.
Michael, I'm wondering, I mean, of course, we all think Germany should feel rightly guilty about the Holocaust. And as we all know, including you, of course, the problem isn't their guilt. The problem is offloading their guilt onto another people and making Palestinians pay the price for Germany's criminal past. But do you think, I mean, like in many other countries, like in the US, for example, and in other parts of Europe, there's a very significant generational cleavage that's opening up. So I don't know enough about Germany to know this, but I wonder whether younger people in Germany, first of all, still, I know that the whole, programming in the Holocaust and educational programs and so forth is very, very strong to keep that sense of guilt going. But I wonder whether younger people in Germany, who are like their peers in America or other countries, more in tune to social media, probably less influenced by mainstream newspapers and so on, are they beginning to change? Like, do they have a greater awareness of, first of all, their own guilt now with respect to Palestine, and are they pushing for change in a way comparable to what we see in other countries too? Do you think, in other words, is there a generational shift taking place in Germany like we see in other countries, or is it kind of holding steady, that narrative from the past?
I mean, there is a sense that the younger generation will not just accept this also ridiculous argument that Germany committed the Holocaust, therefore we must support Israel. It doesn't make any sense, and I think younger people mostly are understanding of this. And you're right, of course, the access to Instagram and other ways of getting footage from Gaza makes a huge difference. Of course, there's no question. I mean, it's a little different to if you look at the UK, for example, where you have these mass demonstrations, 200,000 people, 500,000 people, I think, God knows how many people marching on the streets in London for Palestine. You won't have those kind of numbers in Germany because people are actually afraid. People are afraid of the repression of the police repression, police violence that you've mentioned, seeing the pictures of. That's a regular occurrence, especially in Berlin.
I must say, Michael, we've seen the footage of protests in Germany and the German policemen. I mean, they might as well be the Israeli police. It's extraordinary how brutal they are.
It's unbelievable.
Not that other police forces aren't brutal, mind you, but they seem to be particularly brutal.
Yeah, they're brutal only for this. That's the thing. I mean, I think that's quite revealing. So you have in Germany, you have this very liberal constitution, these basic laws that are very liberal, and you have generally Germany sees itself as a very liberal democracy with huge respect for human rights. Article 25 of the basic laws forces the German state to adopt international law into national legislation, things like this. But on this question, all of this goes away. So there's a concept in Germany called Staatsräson, reason of state, that Angela Merkel made famous in 2008 when she spoke of Germany's reason of state, a part of Germany's reason of state being the security of the state of Israel. And this is used to basically to do anything, even anti-constitutional things, to Palestinians and to other Arabs and to people who support them and to people who say something or do something. And there were a few instances in the last few years that were very, very revealing. One of them was the visit of Francesca Albanese in February. So she came to Germany. I guess she likes the challenge. I don't know. She came to Germany in February. She was supposed to speak at the university in Munich, and she was supposed to speak at the university in Berlin, the Free University, called like that, but not. It's exactly the opposite. So both of these universities canceled the events with her, under pressure by lobby groups, media, the embassy, all this, the phone calls, the whole thing, and so she had to go to alternative venues. And then wherever she went to speak publicly, I was at the events in Berlin. There were two events. One I was participating in, and the other one, this FU event that was somewhere else. Every time there were about 200 policemen in riot gear, and they insisted on sitting inside. So there was a stream, but they insisted on sitting inside because they said it's not only about what is said on the podium, it's also what is said in the audience. So it's that kind of mentality. And the other really glaring example was April 2024. There was supposed to be Palestine Congress in Berlin. Amongst other people, Ghassan Abu Sittar was supposed to speak there, and you probably know he was barred from entering Germany and had a Schengen-wide ban slapped onto him. Yanis Varoufakis was not allowed to speak. He's former finance minister of Greece. And there was, not only this, they closed the bank account of Jüdische Stimme, Jewish Voice for Peace. So this was the first time that they closed the bank account of a Jewish association since the Second World War. It's things like this, and it's laughable, but it's actually very dangerous, and it's been going on like this for since then. And again, the images of policemen, violently assaulting people who are protesting against genocide, it's every day, every week. It's just become completely accepted in Germany, and frankly, when you show this footage to random Germans, they always ask, yeah, but what happened just before? So they always think that the policeman had some kind of reason to, break someone's arm and punch them in the face, which is what you probably saw. And it's that kind of, it's completely crazy.
Michael, in terms of it is completely crazy. It's actually disgusting. It's so perverse, actually, and it makes us all, of course, I know it makes you angry and upset because it's the travesty of the injustice of what's happening, especially in the context of a genocide actually taking place in Gaza. And of course, you mentioned Francesca Albanese and Ghassan Abu Sitta, both of whom have been guests of the show in the past. And Francesca, as you know, has been banned from coming into the U.S. as well. She's on sanctions, the whole thing of having a genocide unfold and the repression taking place at the same time in the official West. So my question for you, Michael, is as a musician, just to shift us a little bit back to where we began this discussion. As a musician, do you feel, it's not a question about your feeling just the obligation, but do you feel a sense of frustration and disappointment in fellow musicians in Germany? In other words, because we feel as academics here, a lot of people have spoken out, but a lot of people, of course, have not spoken out. And a lot of people in academia, for example, want to be, quote, respectable, or they feel this is too controversial, and they've been socialized into silence, kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you feel the same sense as a musician with your fellow musicians, even though I can see through your work that there are many other musicians who are, in fact, breaking the silence, so to speak. So how do you feel as a musician about the general culture in music there?
I mean, look, I work in classical music. So classical music is always slightly more conservative, slightly, older audience, just a little more than general society. So you can imagine if already in general society you have a feeling that this topic is kind of put under a blanket. So in classical music, it's even more. So most of my colleagues don't say anything, or worse, they support this travesty. But there's generally a sense that when you're around colleagues, or when you're around concert promoters and things like this, people don't want to talk about it. People don't want to speak about what is at least on my mind 24/7, but probably on their mind as well. I don't think that they don't think about it. I think they just feel they don't want to speak about this because it's much worse than one thinks, because German cultural institutions and academic institutions are funded by the state, and the state is complicit in this genocide, and it's accused of it at the ICJ. So this complicity is the reason why there are all these repressive measures. It's not just one thing and then the other thing. It's causally linked, and that's why there's a sense of if we say something now, we might lose our funding. If we say something now, we might lose this opportunity. As a single musician, if I say this now, I might not get invited to this festival again. This is and this is probably true. I don't want to pretend like it's not true. It's probably true that in my personal case, that I might not get invited to certain places again to play. I mean, I completely accept that, and I think it's also reasonable to say that. And in academia, it's the same. So in academia, because I also, as a professor, I'm also in contact with a lot of German academics, the few that are actively doing something against this. And there's the same level of frustration that academia is very silent. Universities are silencing these kind of talks, as the example of Francesca Albanese shows. And also just I find especially glaring the silence from legal scholars. You rarely hear anything, and when you do hear something, it's always kind of yes, this could be genocide, but and it's always this thing that there's never a clear kind of saying it how it is thing. And generally, academia is very, very silent. People are scared, and people are generally cowardly. That's not news. People are generally cowardly. They don't want to risk their career. They don't want to risk also the kind of socially awkward situations. They don't want to take part in these And all of this sounds ridiculous in the face of a genocide, but it's still, it's undeniably what is going on in Germany. So I always hope that me doing what I'm doing, if it can motivate a few of my colleagues in academia and in culture to they don't have to do as much as me, but if they do a little more than nothing is still better than nothing. That would make what I do even more worthwhile than if I thought that this was completely, hopeless and no one will ever dare to do anything. So that's also part of why I think it's important that I keep doing what I'm doing, is just to go by example and hope that other people will feel a bit less scared to do something. Because that's another thing with what we were saying, the things that make me mean I can do and say certain things that maybe others would have to take too much risk, and that might motivate, maybe one or two more white Germans to try as well.
Michael, I want to come back to sort of a question that Sari hinted at a little while ago, but also to emphasize the importance of people such as yourself. And when Francesca came to Germany, and to others like that, I'm sure there are others that I can't think of. Because if you look at the polls, I'm always struck that I'm looking at a series of polls, and they show consistently that, and this is obviously anonymous, right? So that it might be generational, but there's clearly a larger and larger segment of the German populations that respond to say that they, for example, have negative views towards Israelis. Like one of them I'm looking at here from June says that it's shifted dramatically. It's now at 57% hold negative views as opposed to 22% or something prior to October 2023, and that there's a majority of people that now would consider it as genocide as opposed to kind of dismiss it out of hand. So this
Sorry, Karim, where is that? What country?
Germany. In Germany.
In Germany, okay, sorry.
Yeah, polls that are showing. So and there are others that kind of show this. And so I think we can link it in the show. We can put some of these links to some of these polling. But the idea that there is this shift that is happening, that despite this this incredible crackdown that's been happening, that we talked about the police, we've talked about this incredible government policies that have been supporting. And I think when I checked, there's about 30% of the arms that the Israelis get is from Germany. The rest, of course, mostly being from the US. So despite this and the media and the racism that goes along with it, people are not being fooled. So they're scared, but there is now a majority, I think, of people that are opposed to this, and that this presumably will grow. So voices such as yourself and others actually play this very important role, because you can speak out in ways that they're obviously too scared to speak out. But can you talk, in your own understanding, do you see this trend? Do you see this resonance, this trend growing? And what are the implications for German politics?
Yeah, it's definitely... Sorry. Yeah, no, it's definitely visible. There's definitely, these polls show a picture of kind of what people really think, if you like. And the question is, how do we get them to do something about it? Because one thing is to be against genocide in Gaza, and the other thing is to actually become active and do something, whatever you're doing. If you're working in the ministry, you have maybe certain ways you can speak to colleagues, and it doesn't all have to be bombastically public. But how do we get people off of their couch? Basically, that's the question with these things. Because you're right, there is a shift in public opinion, and frankly, the reason the state has to be so repressive, including violently repressive, is because there is this shift. If most people agreed with Germany's policy, because this is about Germany's policy, it's not really about Israel's policy. If people really agreed with Germany's policy, there would be no need for any of this violence and any of this repression. But there is, and that shows that there is a shift. There is a shift in the mentality. There's a kind of an understanding, this has gone too far. It's actually not right. It's not that it has gone too far. It's that the genocide doesn't go too far. It's genocide, and it's therefore, to be prevented. But that's the main understanding at the moment, is that, this has gone too far and it must be stopped. The problem in Germany, and I think that's also that's probably an international phenomenon, but it's more stark in Germany. The problem is that when Palestinian experts say something, no one reports it, no one takes it seriously, and no one even thinks about it. The moment someone else comes along, especially if it's an Israeli scholar, and says the same thing, then suddenly we can actually speak about this, and that's been the problem in the coverage from the beginning, is that you had all these Palestinian legal scholars, medical experts, journalists, etc., etc. But you know all of them. You had most of them on your show that were saying these things from the beginning. It's just no one decided to listen to them, and only when other people came along, white people, frankly, only then this is a topic of conversation that you can suddenly have, and it's a problem everywhere. I think that's not just in Germany. Only in Germany, Palestinian experts don't very rarely or almost never get to speak in public. So you will get voices from Palestinians, single voices of people telling their story, but a Palestinian expert, a legal expert, for example, someone like Raji Sourani, I haven't seen him on German television, could have helped.
Michael, sorry, just to follow up, so just to clarify, within the idea of German politics, will this surge of support or distrust of the Israelis at this point, will that reflect in, let's say, elections, in the idea that politicians might begin to be a bit more responsive, or is there a total disconnect between these two on this case?
No, that could happen. It'll be too late for Palestinians, especially in Gaza, but it could happen. So you have of the parties that are in parliament, of course, the AfD, the far right, this is a lost cause. The CDU and the SPD that are the governing coalition. The Christian Democrats are the kind of center right, and the SPD center left. They have, especially in the SPD, there are voices that are starting, in the last few months, are starting to voice their concern. This is only concern at this point. And in the CDU, you have very few, but also, yeah. Then if you go to Die Linke is the left party, and there you have a surge in membership starting in December. I think it started in December 2024, ahead of the elections in February. There was a sudden surge in membership, and all of these new members are pro-Palestine, right? So you have and you have the sense in Germany with the left that it's always split. It's always split between the kind of, on this topic, split right in the middle, between pro-Israel and pro-Palestine. And the voices from the left that are pro-Israel are especially virulent and especially dangerous, because they get platformed in left-leaning publications, and they speak at these and do huge harm. But the left as a party now is in a place where it's calling for mobilization for a protest against the genocide in Gaza. So it has moved from its position of not doing or saying anything from last year. So there is a hope that eventually support for genocide will cost you votes, because that's the only way this is going to change. It's only going to change if it's actually going to cost you votes. If it's not going to cost you votes, then it will not change. So it's my hope. I'm a very pessimistic person in general, and with this I'm also quite pessimistic, because the parties that are in government always seem to do what they do. So the SPD, that is now junior partner of this coalition. Some members are speaking a little more openly, but they had the chancellor until in the former government, the chancellor Olaf Scholz, who was the one at the Brandenburg Gate with the Israeli flag, if I remember, it was him, and the president, of course. So I mean, there's also the problem is that when they change tone, there's a sense that they won't actually take responsibility for the actions that they have committed and for the results of these actions in Palestine, but also in Germany. So all this repression and all these people that got their employment terminated, it's not that this has been taken back. there's no sense of taking responsibility for what they have done. So I'm a very pessimistic person.
Well, Michael, I mean, we should actually probably mention that our cousin, we have a cousin who lives in Berlin and who's an artist in Berlin by the name of Farid Ermali, who actually declined the Kathy Kollwitz Prize precisely because of the hypocrisy and the silence over the Gaza genocide. And I think in the letter that he published, politely declining this prize, he made the point, and I'm wondering how you react to this because I want to shift to music a bit. He made the point, if I remember correctly, I don't want to misrepresent what he said, but he made the point, if I remember correctly, that it's impossible to pretend to go back to the discourse of liberal tolerance and openness and being a free society in the context of a genocide taking place. I mean, so much of what you see in terms of the repression and the silence, I'm not talking about state repression, I'm talking about artists and culture makers and people who are musicians and teachers and so on and so forth, that they still, as if they still want to go on with the previous discourse as if there isn't this huge thing that's taken place. And I'm wondering, that's what I meant in terms, and that brings me to the question about music. What does music, since you are involved in all these extraordinary projects, and I'm going to come to the Said Barenboim Orchestra in a second, but can music actually still build bridges, or do you see it more as a venue of solidarity and awareness, as well as, of course, beauty and music itself? And I'm wondering how you see that, how you reconcile these two different things, the discourse of bridge building that brings people together as opposed to the discourse of actual solidarity and awareness. How do you make sense of these two things?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, of course, with music, you can attempt to do both of these things. If not simultaneously, then at least one after the other. It's possible to create rooms of solidarity, like we do with these Make Freedom Ring concerts for Palestine. These are basically you assemble people in the room that have solidarity with this on this issue, and that normally sit in a concert hall and feel uncomfortable. That's basically what's happening here. They can finally sit.
Can you explain what you mean? Like, what is this Make Freedom Ring? Like, how does it work?
Well, Make Freedom Ring is an artist collective I'm part of that organizes charity concerts for Palestine, for different NGOs, different organizations. And so the people that come to this concert are already sympathetic to Palestine and to Palestinians. And so what I mean is that when they come to our concerts, they sit there, they can actually enjoy the music without feeling slightly uncomfortable. Because when they go to other concerts, where, as I said, classical music is always slightly more conservative than general society. So when they go to these other venues, if they do even go to these other more traditional venues, they might feel uncomfortable, they might feel alone. And here they are in a space where we are all together with this thing. So that, I think, that has its own value. I think it and also these concerts have a very different kind of audience depending on where we play. So in Berlin, it feels like it's more tilted towards the kind of activist scene. So maybe people that don't otherwise go to classical music concerts might come to our concerts. You'll have a few classical music listeners, but mainly you have this more activist scene. And then when we played a concert in Munich or in Frankfurt, it was the opposite. So you had more classical music audience mixed with a few more like younger activists. And I think that these concerts bring these people together in a room in a way that other formats don't. So that I think that's quite important, because the classical music listeners that come to our concerts, so the ones that the kind of older ones that maybe don't go to a protest or don't do other things, but they will come to this, and in this way they will show solidarity, and that's worth a lot, I think. I don't know if that answers your question.
Were you criticized for these concerts?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, now less, of course. Now it's more accepted that as we were saying, there's a kind of a change in discourse slightly, which is worrying in its own way. But there is a change. So now doing a concert to collect funds for something something like Norwegian Refugee Council, which is what we're doing in 2 weeks in Berlin, is much more accepted than it was last year. When we started in March 2024. When we started, we had to be very careful with how we would promote these events, with the messaging, and that of course people will, when you do something like this, people will see, someone will criticize you, obviously. I mean, I don't really mind that. That's not a problem.
Michael, on the question of music, of course, you are part of the East-West or West-East Divan, the Said Barenboim project. And as we all know, I mean, and it actually might be worth recounting for our audience the history of that project. So obviously it goes back to the 1990s, founded by our uncle Edward Said and your father Daniel Barenboim. And one of the ideas was, in that moment in the 1990s, when it seemed like, although Edward was intensely critical of the Oslo peace accords, it seemed like maybe there was the possibility at some point of, reconciliation of some sort. And so, I mean, as I understand it anyway, the project was partly about bridging divides through music and so on, bringing Israeli and Palestinian and more generally Arab musicians together to play as this kind of, cultural attempt to bridge divides. So I guess one question is, first of all, is my account, does that line up with your account historically, going back to the orchestra's foundation in the 1990s? And then secondly, in this moment, the moment that we're talking about now, on the one hand, it seems like bringing people together has never been more urgent. But on the other hand, does a project like this seem right in an age of genocide, which is, I mean, historically, you could even say that there's been genocide since 1948. It's like slow burning, fast burning, more or less. It's a matter of scale and intensity rather than is there or isn't there genocide. But nevertheless, do you think it's still possible to think about that kind of coming together in the cultural realm, given the urgency of the situation in the world itself, or does it? Or
Sadi, you mean normalization? You mean normalization?
No, I don't mean, not necessarily. That's normalization it's kind of a project between states. So I think that's a separate question in a way. I'm talking about collaboration at the level of culture that's meant, as East-West was explicitly meant, to bridge divides and to bring people together, kind of in spite of political or state differences or borders. So I don't know, Michael. What do you see what I'm saying? What do you think of the possibility of cultural reconciliation in the face of genocide? Does it become more urgent or more? I don't know. Are we in a different place now than we were? We clearly are in the 1990s. I mean, you could see I have my own opinion on this, obviously, but you're the guest, so I want to know what you think about these.
Yeah, I mean, we are in a different place than we were in 1999. I think that's quite obvious. The question whether it's more urgent or less urgent, I don't know if I can actually answer that. I think that I think it has its place. I think that's what it's important. It has its place, but it cannot be the only thing that happens. So I think that in a climate where Palestinians are being silenced and don't have platforms to express themselves fully, I think the idea of a dialogue is very between, it can work or it cannot work, but it only works if the Palestinians actually have a platform where they can express themselves as Palestinians without compromises, and then you could think about ways that this can work or cannot work. I mean, it also can only work if there's a clear understanding that every member is equal, and if that's clear to everyone in their mind, and that's what they want to stand for also in Palestine, then there's no reason to reject that. But it's important. I think it's. But that's why I mean, I'm in that, and I'm in things like Make Freedom Ring and these things where I think it's important that Palestinians speak, and then when Palestinians can speak, then the dialogue can happen. If they can't speak, if they're not allowed to speak in their own terms, what can we talk about? It's very hard to make that intellectually work, in my opinion. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. But I'm just wondering whether, for example, I don't know. I mean, just sort of in that earlier phase of the project in the 1990s and early 2000s, for example. I mean, some people were objecting to it on the basis of, well, the Israeli participants in the orchestra, yes, they come and they play with their Palestinian peers or Arab peers or whatever, but then they go and they do their military service. So, like, what has been accomplished in that sense? Sorry, I know this might be a difficult question, but I mean, I think it's.
It is. I find it extraordinarily difficult to answer because, of course, this is a very valid question.
But the point is, Michael. But if that was the case then, how now, right? Other than, like, it seems like the requirements for, like, I don't know. For me, the requirement for trying to collaborate in some way. I mean, we've had Israeli guests on this podcast before, several of them. So it's like we're not opposed to talking, and working together in some kind of way towards like with Ilan Pape or whatever, towards a common objective. But I think at least for me, speaking personally, I can't speak for my brothers, but I'll speak for myself. The standard has to be much higher. There can be no going back to normal at this point, right? There has to be, look, we have to work together to overcome this. This racial state, this racial configuration, this violent enterprise, and then on that basis, okay, we could work together perhaps, but not going back. So that in a way that was one of the things raised in the early phase of the program. But so again, what do you think is, like, are the criteria to be changed? Are the standards to be changed? Are the questions to be asked, or the conditions of possibility different now than they were then? If you see what.
Well, I mean, it's become more. I mean, to answer this question now is more difficult than it was in 1999 or 2000. Although I never had to answer it in 2000, so I don't know. But I mean, to answer it now it's quite difficult because of course, I mean, speaking now really personally, really just for myself, I also I want to work with people that accept that all human beings are equal. I think that's not unreasonable to want this, and I think that insisting to do otherwise would be very strange. So for me personally, also, it's very important that I work with people that are on the same wavelength somewhat in terms of what's happening. But the requirement, I don't know. I mean, that's not even. I mean, it's not even a question I can answer. But I can only answer for myself personally that yes, the bar has to be high. The bar has to be high. Genocide has to be rejected, and it has to be opposed. Otherwise, why? It's very obvious that this has to be, I think, at the center of people's minds right now in this acute situation. And but otherwise, I mean, I don't know practically speaking what this would mean, but I think it's important. I mean, at least for me, I feel like my position and my kind of the things I do and say are known everywhere. So people who play with me, who work with me, who do things with me, either they agree with me or they want to work with me despite of what I do, and then fine. But I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to compromise on the idea that people should enjoy equal rights in a state. It doesn't make any sense to me. It seems to be counterproductive.
Yeah, Michael, it sort of reminds me of it's also important for us to all remember that despite the fact that coexistence has now a very bad reputation because it's always perceived as a way of avoiding talking about the real issues of liberation and freedom and equality. On the other hand, it's also important to remember that Edward Said and Frantz Fanon and all these people have talked about coexistence as liberation. And what you're talking about, of course, is a reconfiguration and the idea of saying, of course, there can be bridge building, but on condition that the parameters, the fundaments are agreed to. In other words, equality, an end to racism, and an abolition of racist structures. And I think that's really important for our listeners and our viewers to think about, as we should also think about and appreciate, that it's not the whatever the initial project was, today there's a different circumstance. And that brings me to a question that I wanted to ask. Maybe it's a bit personal, and we can, you don't have to answer this question, I suppose, but we often, of course, have the legacy of our uncle is huge and prominent for us all the time, and it's obviously shaped and inspired so much of what we do. And I'm wondering, with you, in terms of your father, Daniel, did you have discussions with him about this very topic that we're talking about now, the idea of where the project was in its initial formation and where it's moved over the last few years?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, we've had discussions about kind of what happens to this project, kind of going forward, and what are the ways that this can be made to work, and of course, it's important to think of it also this way. These questions are, I mean, of course, it's a bit hard to answer because I don't have the answer. But it's important to think about what we want from this, what we want to achieve with this, and under what conditions we want to achieve it. I think these are very important questions, and so the orchestra has addressed them in certain ways. A committee has been formed of musicians that kind of try to guide this very discussion about what happens going forward. Also, actually starting to read texts by Edward, altogether, kind of doing things like this. A step like that can be important. And also, I mean, I think carrying the legacy of Edward's work is extremely important. It's important to me personally, but I think it's also important for these institutions that they carry the legacy of Edward's work. That they people understand what Edward was writing, what Edward was saying, and some of the texts you read are very much kind of their time, but other texts are you read them now and it could have been written yesterday, and it's important that the question of Palestine, it's important people read that. I think it's important people read that. It's important people understand, Zionism from the perspective of its victims. I think it's a crucial key to understanding. To get away, not to get away, but to go beyond a bit. Looking at the horror of the genocide in Gaza, looking at the horror of the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, and trying to understand how we got to this point. And that's where I wanted to kind of take us back to where I started, which is the deep regret in not having done what I could have done and what I should have done much sooner. And and that's true for me, but it's true for thousands, hundreds, thousands. I don't know how many people that have failed to do their duty in doing what they can to prevent this, because this, what we see now, is a result of decades and decades of oppression and violence against the group. And as Sari, as you said, a kind of slow burning genocide, if you like, the kind of the intention to destroy the group as such was there from the beginning. So I think that needs to be addressed. Whether it's addressed in these terms, it is something else. But I think getting people to unify around opposition to genocide and opposition to apartheid, I mean, these kind of concepts that are really central to international law. I think we have to all get around that somehow. We have to get people to rally together in opposition to genocide and apartheid. I think that it should be self-understood.
Michael, I agree, obviously, and I think there's another avenue, which is the question of boycott. And I'm wondering if you think that works. I mean, obviously, as a musician, I mean, I'd love to hear your idea of what boycott means in the music world, not just for you personally, but sort of aspirationally, politically. What does it mean? Are there any steps that are going? I mean, in Europe, for example, is there a boycott of the Israeli? I think that they have a National Symphony Orchestra or something like that, or Israeli musicians that come in officially. Is there that kind of, is that, or is it even being discussed, for example? I know, I mean, I follow football, for example. I know the Israeli national team plays, throughout Europe. We talked about this in previous podcasts, the idea that, in fact, I think now there's an international, the World Cup qualifiers are coming up. The Israelis are playing, they're playing in Norway. There's a bit of a controversy coming up on that. So this sense of boycott, is it important, do you think? And secondarily, do you think it can work? Or is there too much repression going on?
I mean, I think some people are silently boycotting already. I think, and the question whether it works or not is, I mean, it's hard to look into the future, but it's hard to imagine it not working if a lot of people do this, even silently. I, for example, I don't go to Israel anymore. It's been now, I don't know, 6-7 years. I don't go there anymore. In my case, it's quite simple. I think it's a kind of mutual thing. I don't think anyone wants me there and I won't go there. So there's not much of a discussion. At the moment, I'm also not coming to
I think the Palestinians would want you there, Michael. I'm sure the Palestinians would.
Well, that's great. Well, then for that, I would go, of course. But that's not... maybe in the future, hopefully. I'm also not traveling to the United States at the moment. I mean, it's also something... that for me, that's linked. But as for the question whether it works, I mean, undoubtedly it works. I think it's worked in terms of economic pressure on certain companies that we've seen kind of, profits declining for certain companies. Also in the cultural field or in the field of sports, it's not really about whether the national team, these 11 players play that game or they don't, or the orchestra plays there or it doesn't. It's about taking away the legitimacy of the state that is committing genocide, to take its legitimacy away. That's the idea behind that kind of boycott, right? And I don't think the classical music industry, I mean, the kind of festivals and concert promoters are ready to kind of not invite the Israel Philharmonic. But I mean, there's no doubt that this would work. This would be a step that would make the legitimacy of kind of that flag, less strong. And in that sense, of course, I mean, I think that I think we have to also frame this in a way that is very clear. States actually have an obligation to sanction the state of Israel. It's not it's not that we're begging. They have an obligation to do this, and companies that are involved in kind of profiting from the occupation that is illegal also have to be. They have to immediately stop what they're doing, and they have to be stopped. So I think all these topics I think have to be also treated with that in mind, that this is a question of obligation. This is not just do I go to Starbucks or not? No, you don't go to McDonald's. It's not good for you, and you do what you can on a personal level, but and you try to pressure your elected officials to do what they must do. I also signed a declaration. You must have heard about this, the Uppsala Declaration that was on this. So there's a German version that's signed by now I think 400 academics. I'm one of them. That kind of is a kind of conscientious objection. We will not work with complicit institutions in etc. etc. So I mean there are these things that are happening, and that also center really the question of obligation. And I think that's where we have to take this. and not to make it about how whether it's something we want or we don't want. It's beyond this at this point.
Something we have to do.
It's something
Michael,
we have
actually,
to do.
On that question of boycotts, I mean, it seems, I mean, if Karim earlier was talking about a sport boycott, there are other, like there's the kind of consumer boycott, but that's the easiest one in a way because you could just not go to certain companies and there's nothing, nobody can stop, nobody's going to force you to go to a certain company or buy a certain product or whatever. But it seems like in a way, and there's an academic boycott too, it seems though that the classical music might be the hardest one of all to initiate, but I'm just wondering whether tactically, whether you put your finger on it, whether a combination of artists increasingly refusing to play in complicit, a festival that's inviting that orchestra to come, for example, for instance, or
difficult because
I know because that's their livelihood too, obviously.
Yeah,
right?
we have to play somewhere, right? It's very. I mean, it's easy for me to say I won't go there and play. That's easy. I can say that, and I can also do it. It's not just that I can say it, but whether I can.
But the flip side is audiences too, right? To get audiences to say we're not going to buy tickets to this event, concert, festival, whatever the thing is. That maybe there's more leverage there in a way than.
Probably, and I would suspect that this is the silent boycott I was talking about. I think that is already happening in many different areas. In classical music, it's going to be very hard to do kind of immediate, full stop. Like that's not gonna. I don't think that's gonna happen. I think little by little, artists like me, who won't go there or won't play there. Others also don't go there. I mean. Many still do. That's the problem. Is that there's no problem. Like I'm not going to accuse someone of going somewhere and playing, but the question is how what you are doing is giving legitimacy to something, or isn't it? That's the question at the end. That's what this is about. It's not about whether you go make your fee if you play a concert somewhere. It's about whether you're giving legitimacy to what's going on. But yeah, classical music. I think it's going to be one of the last places where this will take effect. But by the way, boycotting companies it's easy in the case of McDonald's and Starbucks, but it gets much more difficult with things. Technology. We use our phones. We use the computers. It's not that easy. I think it demands. It demands from people a certain level of, kind of also thinking. I mean, you have to really kind of think about, you can't do it 100%, probably. So you have to think about which areas you want to be kind of actively not giving your money to. And I think that's one way to do it. But I don't think it's possible to kind of, if you look at the list, if you want to boycott all of these companies, it's not that easy. It's not. I would say it's almost impossible to spend just a single day, not actually using or kind of participating in one of these companies. I think it's. I don't know. Maybe you have easier experience.
Well, Michael, thank you for that. Honestly, I think it's a good place to wrap because I think. There's no question that you're right, that we can't do everything, but we do what we can do. And certainly you have been doing what you have been, all that you've done to raise awareness, to be a voice of conscience, to actually, in many senses, to be the sort of secular humanist that Edward talked about in his work and in his life passion. So we really appreciate all that you do and the clarity and the eloquence with which you speak. And maybe one day we can come back to this whole question of regret that you talked about at the beginning and mentioned several times, because it's a very powerful emotion as well. But in the end, we really are very grateful to have you here. We have no regrets having you on this show, and we hope to have you on again at some point, whether in Palestine or in anywhere else. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It was great having you on.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, that was an extraordinary discussion with Michael Barenboim. Sadi, what did you think?
It's so powerful to see somebody with such moral and political commitment, you know. And I wish, as Michael himself said, I mean, everybody, all anybody could do is do what they can do in the realm that they're in, right? So writers can write, musicians can talk, and whatever. Everybody does what they can. But as he pointed out, the problem is that most people aren't doing anything. And we know that, of course, from our realm of academia, most academics, even if they're sympathetic, they're not necessarily saying anything or doing anything. If more of us did something, it would be more effective than a few of us speaking and reading and writing and talking and you know, starting podcasts or whatever. I mean, we should all be doing something. And of course, in the context of the genocide in particular, one reason why it's so urgent for all of us to do more is because the states, our governments, are not just doing less. On the contrary, they're opposing progress and movement on this issue. And so the statistics that we've often, Karim raised them in the conversation today, they've come up in a different context before, about popular opinion. It's even in the US, it's very, very, very clear, especially on the left, on the Democratic Party, people who are Democrats or liberals or whatever. The support for Palestine and Palestinians is overwhelming now. But our governments are lagging far, and our institutions lagging far, far behind. The only way we're going to get our governments and our institutions, including our universities, to change is by all of us doing more. And if we don't, they won't, basically. They're not going to change because they feel bad. They're going to change because they're pressured to change. That's how historical change always has happened. So I think Michael is such an exemplary figure in that sense because of his moral clarity, his political clarity, his the principles by which he acts. And so he's, there's a lesson there for everybody, I think. Karim, what do you think?
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think he's brilliant in what he was doing, not just musically, obviously, but in terms of speaking out in these times. And I mean, I thought it was interesting that Michael, a couple of times at least, kind of mentioned that he regretted not doing this pre-October 2023. And then Osama, I think if I heard him correctly, I think he answered your question by saying that, of course, he knew, because you were suggesting perhaps he didn't know, he didn't have the knowledge, etc. But it's more that he knew, but wasn't in a position or wasn't in the space to speak out the way he's speaking out post October 2023. So it's interesting. There is a transformation. So we talked about public opinion, but there's transformation for people like Michael, who now obviously will never go back. It's a cause, and it's a personal cause, and it's a professional cause that I think will go on for a very, very long time. So it's like a breaking point within these European societies, in Germany in this case, but I'm sure there are others in other of these European countries, and we've talked a lot about America. So it's I found that to be very interesting, as well as his discussion about German society and the kind of his analysis of the crackdowns, the police, the brutality that's taking place, and the fear. I mean, it's just looking at the pictures, I would be terrified. I mean, those guys are not a joke. There's no giving and taking. Yesterday, I think it was 2 days ago, when we saw these pictures where they were beating up this Irish woman. And then I think it turns out that they broke her arm on top of it all. And they whisked her out. Hardly a scary looking woman. I mean, but they whisked her out. The usual police thing where you see like 10 huge guys taking out one woman and kind of beating them along the way. This stuff is intimidating. It is scary. There's no doubt about it. So I think, it's just interesting to think about all these things. And he represents the best part of all of this.
But Karim, if I could actually come back on that. I mean, of course, that's true. And the police brutality, by the way, the Germans, obviously, they specialize in it historically, but I mean, other police forces, here in LA, they're hardly angels, and in England also. But what's interesting on that particular point,
and in Egypt, and other places.
Yeah, of course, right.
Everywhere.
But the point is that that's the area of, in a way, public protests, right? Like street protests, and demonstrations, which are also very, very important, clearly. But in a way, what Michael's getting us to think about is our professional commitments and the professional spaces that we occupy too. Like, what can you do within your profession to bring about change, or to boycott, or to say, I'm not going to play in this place, or yeah, obviously.
What is it about? I mean, we've had these discussions a lot, and I'm wondering, what is it about academics, do you think, that we think ought to speak up? I mean, who are what moral position do academics have where we think they need to be better than others? You know what I mean? I mean,
that it's not that yeah, I think that's a good question. It's not that academics are morally superior or have a moral imperative more so than others. It's that there's a whole discourse in academia, a whole language in academia, a whole way of thinking about the world in academia over the past 30, 40 years, which is to protest against injustice, to give voice to the voiceless, to speak up against those who've been erased, especially in the history profession. And yet, when push comes to shove, what you see happening now is how many people don't speak up. And, and as Michael put it, I can't remember which part of the interview he put it, but the idea of not speaking up, the hesitation, the elision, the ellipsis, all these things add up ultimately and pave the way to where we are today. And I think that's the point. It's not that academics have more responsibility, but in the end, we do use words. And we are people who write and publish.
Well,
if
I can add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, if I can add to that. That's a very important point. But Michael was also talking about musicians specifically. I mean, he was talking about academics, but he's also talking about musicians. And of course, the thing for if a musician takes a stand and says, "Well, I'm not going to play for thus and such, or in this place or that venue or whatever," that's the musician's ink. Like he won't be able to pay rent, or she won't be able to pay rent, right? So it's there's a cost for an individual artist that's different than for most academics, especially tenured academics. And so I think that's in a way, for those of us who have tenure, the obligation and pressure to speak should be much more than it is. Obviously, there are plenty of people who do.
Fair point, Sadi. Fair point. But of course, remember that most tenured academic, it's the people who are speaking out actually for the most part tend to be, I don't know if it's actually tenured academics as much as it's lecturers and as much as it's graduate students and students and so on. People who are actually quite vulnerable who do speak out. So it's not, I think it's more the idea that of getting to this point where, as Michael was saying, getting to this point of realizing the power of these individual steps that each person can take to the best of their abilities. It's not, obviously, I'm not saying, right, Karim, we're not saying that people should speak out and just, self-immolate, although that's happened actually a couple of times. It's more that people should do whatever they can do, and that's really where it is right now. But Karim, in terms of the whole discussion of German history, what did you think of that? And I think you brought up the question of Namibia. What did you think of his? I mean, it's a really important point to raise, to bring this into the frame.
Yeah, I mean, I asked that question somewhat because when I was, here and at one point spending a lot of time in some of these embassies, I get invited to this and, working lunches and working dinners and, the ambassadors and the diplomats that would come and go. So I would be, at some point, I stopped doing that a long time ago because it just gets annoying. But at one point, I was doing quite a bit of this. And inevitably, when some German ambassador or deputy ambassador or political affairs person or whatever would show up, and we'd start talking about this, of course, Palestine would start coming up. And then the first thing they would say, well, you have to understand our history. And I'd look at this, no, I know your history. I've studied your history. You need to know my history. And then they would just have this look of, what the hell? What are you talking about? Well, I have to know your history. What the hell does that mean? So it's this business. It rubs me the wrong way when we get lectured about, not Michael, obviously, but by sort of, these other Germans who will tell us, well, you have to know our history. We have a responsibility. Yeah, I agree. You do have a responsibility. And your responsibility should be to protect anybody that's under genocide. And yes, of course, you can have a special relationship and a sensitivity towards your Jewish population. Of course, that's perfectly understandable. But your history goes a lot deeper than that, than the Holocaust. I mean, it's before that. So I mentioned Namibia, or what came to be Namibia, because it predates the question of the Holocaust, and so therefore predates the question of their sense of guilt towards the Jewish communities and things like that. Or I think Michael called it the collective Jew in Israel. So you have these things. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with you, but I think it's important also to remember that the state doesn't have guilt. This is a purely, from the state's perspective, this is a transactional,
That's
of completely cynical. Yeah, exactly.
Guilt,
it's official
guilt,
policy.
But it's part of the state policy.
As Merkel said, Staatsräson. I mean, it's like it's part of their raison d'être, the state.
Okay,
Exactly.
That's their version of guilt institutionalized. That's guilt put into institution in their terminology.
Yeah, an extraordinarily cynical thing of pretending to atone for the horrors of the Holocaust at the expense of the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And then
So
telling
my
us that we have
question.
yeah.
So my question to you, and that was my question to Michael, and I'd love to hear what you guys say about this, because I keep thinking about it. Why should we give the Germans a pass and start this discussion with the Holocaust, as opposed to going back further and saying that like many European countries, there's a history of racism, colonialism, and all that stuff, and that is a better explanation to why they treat Palestinians and Arabs and stuff like that the way they're doing. Or at least it's one of
the colonial history. The colonial history.
So that's
of racism
that's
takes us back.
The colonial history, yeah.
At
At least it's a very important one. May not be the only one. I mean, obviously, the Holocaust is very important, but it predates the Holocaust question.
Yes, that's true, Karim. But the difference is specifically for Germany, their way of atoning for the Holocaust is by offloading their guilt onto us. That's what's so specifically objectionable about their way of reconciling themselves to their own history. So, of course, the British and the French and the Belgians were all involved in these genocidal enterprises too. It's not like the Germans were unique in that. But the specificity is we committed this terrible sin in our past, and therefore, to atone for it, we're going to basically, you're going to pay the price for our sin. That's what's so...
But Sadi, the other question that comes up from this discussion is, why do the British and the French and the Belgians and everyone else not feel guilt, or the Americans for that matter, not feel guilt about all the horrors that they've inflicted in terms of their... I mean, do you see what I'm saying? I mean, so this whole thing of guilt is also as if to assume that these Western powers and empires that have committed genocide after genocide...
Exactly. It's not. Germany was destroyed. Don't forget, Germany was destroyed and had to be rebuilt, in a very particular way. It was absolutely destroyed and then started from scratch and rebuilt. And this was hardwired into it. And you get to larger questions, which is that Germany is not allowed to have a military that goes abroad. Now that stuff is changing. And they're going to increase their military budgets. And frankly, it's terrifying.
Yes, and I would just, for our viewers and listeners, I think we should end with this point, but they should all go and read George Antonius, The Arab Awakening, 1938. The book was published. And you should take a look at the very last page of that book, not the appendix, but the last page of the actual text of the book, where Antonius, or the last pages, where Antonius is talking about the hypocrisy of European powers. He wasn't talking about Germany. He was talking about, actually, in this case, Britain. Pretending to resolve what was, of course, European anti-Semitism, and what the Europeans used to call their Jewish question, at the expense of the Palestinians. This is 1938. He wrote this book, so before the Holocaust. And so the idea that these questions, as you say, Karim, and you by bringing up Namibia, these questions are not older in terms of the racism, in terms of colonialism, in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of the linkages of all these things, are ones that need to be asked. But again, to get us back to Michael, it was good to have somebody speaking with such clarity and such eloquence, honestly. And so it's good to see you guys.
Samo, just one other point, because just on this, which is that he's, of course, Jewish, Michael. And so, in all this discussion you're talking about, and he mentioned the Jewish Voices for Peace that's been outlawed, or Jewish, and their bank accounts have been closed. So we're talking about, yes, this great responsibility. On the other hand, they're cracking down on dissenting Jewish voices too. I mean, it's pretty incredible to think about that.
It is incredible. Of course, it's incredible. The whole thing, the fact that we're talking about a genocide live streamed in 2025, is the most incredible thing. And the gaslighting that's gone along, where the entire sort of official Western world, not the entire official, but much of the official Western world, including the US, which, as you saw yesterday, have banned all Palestinian passport holders from visas, including children coming to seek medical treatment for injuries that they sustained probably by US bombs, or maybe German bombs at this point. I don't know.
And diplomats. And diplomats to the UN.
And diplomats and family and everything. Just the sheer levels of anti-Palestinian racism in the context of a genocide. It's mind-boggling. All right, guys. It is. All right. Good to see you guys.
Bye.